All right, good day to those who are viewing this video on first principles and beyond in teaching HUMSS topics courses. Okay, so this one is for training purposes. So of course, if there are some contextual differences or contextual, of course, specifications, I'm very much sorry. Okay, so yeah. So this is going to be the content of the presentation. So it ranges from highly conceptual, highly theoretical topics, all the way to specific issue-based ones. Okay, so this one is also quite interdisciplinary, sometimes even transdisciplinary, trying to migrate from one point to another. So kindly, I hope you're able to follow that through. Okay, so this one also, this video presupposes that the watcher or the viewer is also already quite knowledgeable or already quite informed about any of these or any specific parts of these topics. So if you haven't, if you haven't really been that informed yet, so of course, feel free to stop the video first and then go consult other sources, simpler sources, better sources, okay, for you to have a good understanding, okay? So generally, any start of the discussion on HUMSS would require our students to also have a differentiation of these three bodies of knowledge. We have social sciences, natural sciences, and the humanities. All right. So what exactly are these, and what exactly is, let's say, the point of reference in which we see the differences? Okay. So the first one is we're talking about the social sciences. Okay. Social sciences refer to the human being. So we're here in this discussion. Although there are a lot of course, different points of differentiation, but for the intents of this video, we're talking about the human being first. Okay. So the human being in the social sciences is a highly interactive um, entity, or a highly interactive, or at least a very interactive individual, wherein, of course, he's part of a system. That's why it's called individual within a system. Now, this means that, as the quote that we often hear says, which is all about no man is an island, that simply states that we all need interaction and we all inevitably have to interact, whether we like it or not, whether we also know it or not. And even in cases that we choose not to interact, there are also some specifications, implications, and repercussions when it comes to humanity, or when it comes to the human person within this system or within the society. Now, these are the examples of disciplines. Take note that these are not all the disciplines under the social sciences, like sociology, political science, economics, anthropology. There's still psychology, although psychology also has some junctures of the natural sciences. We also have what else are there? Geography, which is also obviously having some junctures in the natural sciences. We also have linguistics, although linguistics this time has its junctures in humanities as well. So later we would see what exactly are the differences. Okay. Secondly, we're now talking about the natural sciences, which sees the human being as living organisms, meaning to say they bear life. All right, they're capable of sustaining life, and they're capable of giving birth to another life form. All right, which is another human generally. Okay. Now, these are also seen as individuals with systems, whether we're talking about systems of organs like biology, for example. Given that you have a nervous system, you have the capability to think, or have that nervous system has the capability to say some sort of dictate what your body can do. Same, for example, for the digestive system. The digestive system gives you the capability to consume food products. The reproductive system gives you the ability to have sexual urges and reproduce another human being. So those kinds of things. So that's an individual with a system, or with different systems. Another case in which chemistry sees the human body as, for example, comprised of several chemical reactions. For example, emotions have chemical reactions, food digestion has chemical reactions, so on and so forth. So that's how they see it. Mathematics is also part of that, although we would see that math would have a lot of junctures in the social sciences, like in economics, of course. Since economics talks about resources, Definitely, there's a lot of math in there, especially when we talk about GDP, GNP, all of those things, microeconomics. What else? Actually, almost all of these social science disciplines also have already given birth to quantitative research designs, say even sociology, say their surveys. For example, in political science, of course, you have voters. Of course, you count votes. Therefore, it has math, so on and so forth. So when your students would say they took HUMSS because they don't want math, well, they're kind of wrong, all right? So they're already at the point where the social sciences have already borrowed a lot of concepts and methods in the natural sciences or even in mathematics at least, okay? Now, the third one, which is humanities, this one is seeing the human being as a highly expressive and systems of conditions. What do you mean by that? This means that, for example, their ability to express and the way that in which that they express themselves, they are actually bound by the conditions that they're surrounded by. Say, for example, in the arts. So, in the arts, the way we produce arts in the high classes would be different when we talk about popular arts. Or for example, in literature, poetry by the rich or poetry by the royals, poetry by the wealthy, by the elite would be different from the poetry of the peasants or of the poetry of the working class, you know. Or for example, poetry by men would be different from poetry by women, poetry by the queer and whatnot, you know. So those are things that already concede to the intersectionality, you know, of humans and society. So that's where we see it in human beings, in humanities. All right. So there. Now, proceeding to paradigms, theories, and concepts, very heavy in, let's say, uh, yeah, in itself, concepts, very heavy in terms. But here is where you see social science at the apex of knowledge production, which is research. So you have to also have some understandings of paradigms, theories, and concepts. Okay. Paradigms generally are the ways in which we look at the world. Theories are the way we explain things, usually comprised of variables. So you've heard of, for example, in basic research classes of dependent and independent variables. Sometimes there's also extraneous variables and whatnot. So it's the same for the social sciences. Later we will talk about how theories would appear in social science contexts. Third, we're talking about concepts. All right. Concepts are, wait, yeah. Concepts are ideas that are usually intellectual representations of things. Usually we're talking about abstract things, but also have deeper manifestations. For example, when you talk about democracy, usually it's attributed to other concepts like freedom, equality, justice, and whatnot. Or for example, when we talk about human agency, meaning to say you have the ability to dictate upon your life, that has something to do with capability. What else? That has something to do with education. That has something to do with what else? Even rights. Even what else? Freedom. Yeah, so you kind of get what I'm saying, all right? That at a snap, it's not kind of intuitive, meaning to say, justice doesn't. The way we understand justice is not, one and the same. Okay, so these are things that we have to discuss. That's why they're there. That's why they're concepts. Okay. So this is one example of a paradigm, all right, or of a series of paradigms. Although there are a lot more paradigms, just to be very clear, that aside from, for example, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, there are sociological paradigms like positivism, meaning to say that an absolute truth can be attained, all right, or an absolute truth can be arrived at about society through objective methods or through objective means. That's one. Another paradigm is, for example, the Marxist paradigm, the way in which they see society as purely material. All right, that's one. And the way that they see the world is, for example, comprised of contending interests, between the classes. Usually that's between the elite class or a class that controls the modes of production versus the working class, those who actually make it work, but then again do not get the necessary compensation that they should get. Another worldview or another paradigm is the feminist paradigm. This one, they see the world as contentions between the sexes, between men and women, or between the patriarchy and the rest. But we know that the rest could either be the women Or we also know that a part of that, the rest, quote unquote, could be the queer because they don't suffice the standards of patriarchy or of being masculine. So all of those things, you would see that that's the way in which they see the world. So aside from gender, aside from class, aside from objective reality, there are a lot of worldviews right there. Let's take these for example, because let's try to compare pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. What are their sources of truth? Because these are the differences of these three paradigms are based on the sources of truth. According to the pre-modern view, the truth can only come from either religious authorities or religious doctrines or superstitions. Say, for example, the reason why we get sick is because of punishments by God or because of being unlucky. That's it. All right. But we know that by the time that the modern view arrived, or by the time that modernity came, we understood that sicknesses are born out of different conditions. And how did we know that? Through science. And that's the source of truth according to the modern view. But for example, the reason why you got, for example, a particular sickness was because of number one, maybe it was genetic, it was hereditary, that some illnesses are actually, passed down from one generation to another. Second is maybe you are born out of it because, or you got it because it's born out of poor environment conditions, like maybe your household or maybe the home that you live in is quite not that clean or whatever, so that allowed you to get this particular sickness. Or for example, secondhand smoke, you didn't get, for example, this particular lung ailment just because God doesn't like you, but you know that based on science, since you live with a lot of smokers in the house, you would most probably get a lung ailment yourself. Third one is the postmodern view. How does truth appear? The postmodern view is the most interesting, but it's also the most volatile because it says that in the postmodern view, it's either everything could be the truth or nothing could be the absolute truth. How does that look like? I'll give an example, and I'll try to start with a neutral example, which is about art. When, for example, let's use an artwork. When, for example, the Mona Lisa was painted by the reality. For example, his subject may be a woman or maybe the expression, the facial expression, which has been bound to a lot of interpretations as time went by. However, when we see that maybe other scholars of art, other scholars of the Renaissance was also able uh, to see, all right, was also able to interpret what could the meanings be, there came a time that, of course, the artist's view might not be the most impressive truth, might not even be the truth because it's just one dimension of reality. How would you say that it's the artist's view who is, for example, superior over the others? What if, for example, it speaks to me differently compared to another viewer, and that has already become the way in which we consume different art, different media, different literature eventually? Say, for example, movies, they also speak different realities to different subjects or to different audiences, sorry. Or they also talk about songs, that's one example of the postmodern view. Let's try to use medicine as an example of the postmodern view. How would they say that? Well, this one is a reactionary to the modern view in a sense that do we really see sciences as the end all be all of acquiring the truth? Because we all know that either number one, science would give us an incomplete version of the truth, whether for human error or for human intent reasons, or just simply there are bounds in which we cannot really understand anymore. Like for example, extraterrestrial beings. Are there really aliens? There are, of course, some scientific bounds existing right now. That's why we haven't had much research on extraterrestrial things. So that's one. Another one is, for example, a typical example, vaccines. We all know that vaccines, the best intention is to reduce sicknesses, to reduce infection rates. But we know that it has side effects that at some point the medical community was either negligent or really incapable of actually preempting until, a lot of vaccines have already been uh, administered. Because, scientific what do you call this, experimentation would only include, like, I don't know, a few thousands of people. But if you're going to vaccinate the entire world, which is billions, then definitely there would be a lot more cases that would have a different outcome compared to your scientific experiment trials, or experiment, yeah, based on that particular group. Then again, that has led to some extreme beliefs of anti-vaccine people, or anti-vaxxers, as they are popularly called. So now they're rejecting the sciences, or maybe they're rejecting some narratives imposed by medicine and the medical community, that maybe vaccines are the answers to, for example, combating polio or combating even COVID-19, because they're more afraid, or some people are more afraid of dying of the vaccine or dying because of the vaccine versus dying of COVID. And that's also an equally alarming, thought, because science have, I'm not saying that again, this is me saying from a person, this is me from a personal vantage point. Science is also not the end all be all in this case. But science has provided us with a lot of things, right? The natural sciences and even in the social sciences, that by this time we cannot live without if these things weren't even used, utilized, or even discovered. So that's the two sides, or those are the two sides of postmodern views and how they actually manifest in our society today. Alright. Now, some scientific properties of theories. Now, we've also used science. Now, let's also apply it to the concept of theory. Now, theories, if you would remember from this one, right, they explain the relationship of variables. So, how does that look like? Always notice that when we say explanations of the relationships of variables, we're talking about, for example, situations. We're talking about control groups, okay? Although control groups aren't necessarily the same in the social sciences, comparing it to natural sciences, simply because you cannot experiment on people. And even if you can, it has ethical implications. But here's how theories would look like in a social science context. Although this one from Sodaro in 2008, this one is a discussion on comparative politics. But I think this is also worth discussing in a general sense, all right? So I hope I'm not committing some sort of conceptual stretching, meaning to say I'm applying a concept that's originally placed in this situation or in this context, and I'm placing it in another inappropriately. So let's start. Theories have the ability to define things. When we say define things, they set conceptual clarity. That's something that I will also mention later. But when we also say definition, we try to limit how a particular word is used. More on that when we talk about context. A concept, sorry. Second is descriptions. Descriptions talk about the ability to create vivid images. When you say vivid images, you're able to answer how it looks like. All right, but it doesn't stop there, because these theories are not just descriptions. It also has to have explanatory properties. When we say explanatory properties, it has the ability to answer the question why. I'll give an example. In Philippine politics, a classic example in research and in social science, we're able to define, for example, what's a democracy. Democracy is a system that people are allowed to vote for their next president, for example, although a lot more could be stated. Descriptions happen this way. For example, I will say that in a country that relies on the masses for mobilized support, especially during campaign season and the elections, there's a lot of room, for example, for personality politics coming in. There's a lot of room for what else? For vote buying. There's a lot of room for extortion. When you say extortion, threatening people, threatening communities just for them to side with a particular candidate or for a particular party. Now that's a description right there. You're able to say that maybe your claim is the elections in the Philippines are not fair due to the following. Number one, extensive vote buying. Number two, what else could that be? Yeah, all the things that I mentioned earlier. But the third one is explaining why is this the case. Instead of just simply saying the Philippines' election system is not fair because of the following reasons: vote buying, extortion, and propaganda, maybe. But it has to go deeper than that. You have to answer the question, why is there extensive vote buying? All right? Especially if the democratic context prohibits the discussion or prohibits the proliferation of vote buying. So that still merits the question. Why is there vote buying? Number two, why is there extensive propaganda? Are you saying that maybe the masses are easily swayed by personalities? So something like that, like just go to a particular barrio or go to a particular barangay and then, do some viral dance right there, Is that really the case? So that's the deeper answering of the question of why. Hence explanation. Same thing, you don't just say Rodrigo Duterte is the first Mindanaoan president. That's one definition. The descriptions are he has been popular because of his machismo, and what else? Populist rhetoric, meaning to say he says the PI word a lot, he swears in live television a lot, and people seem to like it. That's a description right there. But the next question is why. All right. So there could be a lot of reasons, and do not just get it from one source. That's why research comes in. So you can conduct, for example, a survey, maybe a survey of 1,000 respondents, asking them why, or do they like some sort of this president and the way he talks, you know. And after talking about 1,000 responses, that's how you come up with your explanation, maybe. Okay. Now, aside from explanations, by the way, the first three properties of theories are important. You cannot stop at descriptions alone. You cannot stop at definitions alone. Otherwise, there isn't any scientific merit when we talk about theory. So when you use this in your classroom, you have to demonstrate how theories work. All right. Later, we would have some examples of other theories. Now, going further, theories increase their efficacy. When we say efficacy, the way in which we use it in research, all right? So more on that in a different session. They increase their efficacy if they have the ability to predict future scenarios, future cases that also exhibit the same descriptions and definitions, and maybe even explanations. Say, for example, it already happened in the United States that the Democrat Party, represented by Joe Biden, was able to defeat the Republican re-electionist Donald Trump. Now, can we replicate the same thing here in the Philippines, for example, that even if Rodrigo Duterte cannot run anymore for the presidency, but he's opting for running as vice president, and definitely the administration would be nominating, or would be, letting someone run under their helm, So are we able to replicate the same model that maybe we're able to defeat the populist narrative that this guy is propagating? So let's see. Hence, when we talk about prescriptions, this means that it has the ability, theories, that includes explanations, descriptions, definitions, and even predictions. They have the ability to be translated to policy agenda and even actual policies, actual movements, say by civil society and social movements. So, for example, knowing that Joe Biden was able to overcome the populist narrative by Donald Trump, can isang bayan under former Associate Justice or the retired Justice Antonio Carpio, can they replicate the same thing? And if they can, what should they do? That's part of the prescriptions. So you see, from that point alone, from pointing out a populist president until prescriptions, that's how you can demonstrate it to your students when they say what the social sciences are for. In an era wherein the social sciences are quite, being eclipsed by the natural sciences and even by the business management people, this is how we demonstrate our significance to the students. Okay, so that's theories. Lastly, when we talk about concepts, according to the same author, all right, definitions provide conceptual clarity. I've mentioned that. So, for example, let's talk about the example of human agency. When we say human agency, the ability to dictate upon your life through individual choices, through privileges available to you. So that's human agency. Human agency, for example, and this already goes to the second point, which is about concepts having shades of meaning in particular contexts. Human agency in economics would be different to human agency in political science. I'll give an example. Human agency in economics would look like this. I have the ability to buy product A and product B, because both cost, for example, 100 pesos, and in a month, I create a lot more than 100 pesos. Definitely, I can buy like even a lot, like maybe even 100 times of these or 100 more of these products, but that's beside the point. But when we say human agency, I have the ability to practice my human agency by buying either A or B or both, because my income can allow me to do that. Number one, that's human agency. Number two, because according to rational choice theory, I have the ability to become a self-maximizing agent. Meaning to say that if I choose either A or B, that would always be a self-maximizing choice. That's the assumption by rational choice, that I have the ability to become self-maximizing. Now that's human agency right there in economics, especially in the context of in the context of consumers or consumption. But human agency would look different in political science. Say, for example, again in elections, my human agency would be different because, for example, as someone who finished maybe an international studies degree in one of the most prestigious universities, comparing it to someone who never even reached high school, we have different measures of human agency right there. My human agency would be more on, of course, having a degree, comparing it to this person who doesn't even have high school education, but still we have the same right, which is, for example, to vote. Then again, we would vote for example, different candidates because of our backgrounds. Now, that's the difference of human agency right there, because I'm now dictating the future of my country, and he's also going to dictate the future of my country. But how is it different? All right, because of our backgrounds. That's just one. Okay, among the many possible reasons between the differences of human agency, and that's how you see the difference of human agency between the different disciplines of the social sciences. Okay. But aside from these, it's also important to see that concepts explain how a variable works. So this one, let's go back to the example of the elections. Assuming that I am 18 years old or beyond 18, which is I'm really beyond 18, but there's another person who is just maybe as educated as I am, just as capable as I am, simply a copy of me, but is not 18 years old. Meaning to say he's not capable of voting. Human agency can be defined as the ability to vote, especially, for example, in researches about elections. So meaning to say, human agency for that guy who is exactly like me, but is not 18 years old, cannot translate to actual human agency because he cannot vote. So remember that concept in research that we call operationalization. So given that we know that agency is choice, but how are we doing the choice? So that's one. In another example, assuming that I can say I have the agency or I have the choice to say President XYZ is the best president in the solar system. Just an example, okay? And there's 1,000 more who would say the same thing. Exactly the same thing. President XYZ is the best president in the solar system. Now, does that mean we all have the human agency? Well, not necessarily. We may all have the human agency in the context of political communication. When we say political communication, it's the ability to communicate about politics. That's how simple I can define it. But maybe for further clarification, we can say the ability to talk to people about politics, or the ability to send messages about politics. So that's political communication. But what if, for example, those thousands of people that can say the same thing as I did, what if three-fourths of them are not even real people, that they're trolls? So that's three-fourths of 1,000. That's 750 down the drain. Excuse me. 250 more. Assuming that in that 250, 50 are unregistered voters. That's 50 more down the drain. You have 200 more people. But for example, let's assume this case where it's on election day and suddenly 7 of them chose not to go to the precincts because they're scared of COVID. Hopefully COVID's not anymore a problem by that time, but let's assume it is. So that's 250 minus 50 minus 7. That's how many that's how many it's left. Okay. Cannot count at this point. But you see that human agency, even in that particular situation, we're talking about the same thing. all right, which is the ability to communicate. But what if a lot of them are not real people? What if they're not registered voters? What if they suddenly did not go to the election precincts? Does that make a difference? So that's going to matter when you're now talking about a variable in research. Fourthly is concepts also provide connotations and denotations. This is now associating an existing concept with another concept that's related or that is maybe caused by this particular concept. Okay. So for example, later development as freedom by Amartya Sen, you would see that how he developed his understanding of freedom is hinged on the ability to, make choices because you're educated, because, or for example, to make good choices about your health because you have health insurance and whatnot. So freedom for him was associated with the concept of development. They're not necessarily the same, but for him, it was one that hinged on one another. Okay, so those are all for concepts. So, okay, now we're proceeding to the discussion of institutions and structures. Two very important terms that you might need to consider because more often than not in some courses you would use them, and in some cases you might also haphazardly interchange them, which at some point may be virtually harmless, but in some vital cases they are harmful. So be mindful of that. Now, some basic discussions: institutions are entities, meaning to say they are organized in society based on what they can do. All right. Later you would see what I'm exactly talking about. Structures, on the other hand, are relationships or patterns of interaction that govern us in society. So what am I talking about? So here, in terms of institutions, usually sociology classes or UCS classes. Wait. All right, thank you. Sorry. So as I've said, those courses would generally talk about these institutions: marriage and family, education or educational institutions, the government or political institutions, religion or religious institutions, economic and financial institutions like banks, insurance companies, central banks, and whatnot. Okay. Now, in terms of institutions, they have the different needs, functions, and roles. Functions are usually what they should do, and roles talk about what exactly do they do. So roles are usually more specific. I mean, for the intents of this video. Okay, so for example, family. Family, as we've known for quite some time now, that's the most basic unit of society. But the family's function is generally for initial cultivation of individuals, because the reason why they're called the basic unit or the most basic unit of society is because that's your first um what's anyone's first exposure to anything in society. For example, you've had your first encounter of governance under your parents. For example, you're not allowed to do this because of that, because of this, because of that. You're not allowed to also do this because of that. You should do this because of that. Hopefully, if you got your reasons, that's quite fortunate for you. But some parents, of course, would simply say, because I said so. Now, that's also a demonstration of governance right there. Say, if your parents might be authoritarian or authoritative, that's also parenting styles. Uh, we see that when we go out there, we kind of see the same thing. Okay, kind of see that our governments are also, authoritative, authoritarian. For example, if you're lucky enough to have liberal parents, you would also have the same thing. So that's your first exposure of a government through your parents. Same thing, first exposure of education. They taught you how to use your spoon, use your toilet, say po and opo, and all of those things, or even count and read. Some families are fortunate enough to teach their children how to read and write and count. So that's your first exposure of education. First exposure of religion. Sometimes, or actually most of the time, especially here in the Philippines, you're taught that there's God, that you should not do this because Jesus is watching. That's your first conception of religion. Same thing for economics, right? Or for financial institutions. You're given this some sort of value of money, and that's because, if you're rich enough, yeah, can be given this amount of money for no particular reason or for no definite reason, while some less fortunate ones, they don't even have the money for themselves, and of course, how would they share economic knowledge, financial knowledge to their children, right? So that's basically why it's the most important, or that's the most basic unit of society. So that's cultivation. That's initial cultivation. And how do they do that? So parenting methods. So by implementing parenting methods, what else? By sending them to good schools. Hopefully, families are able to do that. By what else? Interacting with them more often. So yeah, education. So same thing. The functions generally of education is also for cultivation, but this one is for a more holistic development. So you're not just taught algebra, history, what else? Grammar. You're also taught how to be a good person. You're also taught how to, what else? To interact better with people. So you're also taught how to express yourself properly. So that's the cultivation that is expected. That's the cultivation function of education. So roles, there are a lot. Teach you lessons, conduct online classes this way, many more. Okay. Governments, the functions of governments are usually for, that's why states have governance functions, which is to create policies. And what are usually these? And what are usually these roles? Sorry. Usually in political science discussions, there are the three inherent powers of the state. It's police power, eminent domain, and taxation. So those are specific ways in which the state can enforce its power to us. Religions have what kind of functions? Functions of religions are generally also for spiritual cultivation. So aside from cultivation, what else? I keep on saying cultivation. Religions functions are for support mobilization as well. So because religions have to be social. You can never establish your own religion like, I don't know, tomorrow you would discover some person uh worshipping SpongeBob, for example, or your other friend worshiping Rick and Morty, so those kinds of things. Okay, so religions have a social aspect in them, and usually we only subscribe to the mainstream ones. Okay, very rarely do we see those specific things that I've mentioned earlier. I don't even know if they exist, but if they do, that's very minute. So usually, for example, the first religion that you would join in is the one that's joined by your family. So for example, being born into a Christian family, you're expected that maybe you're going to support, all right, the Christian churches, or you're going to or you're expected to go to church every Sunday if you're Catholic. So that's the support mobilization that they try to ask from you now. So the role is to continue practicing the Eucharist for the Catholics. For Christians, well, I don't know actually. So for Christians, it's to, of course, jumpstart worship, activities. So that's the role of the churches, or that's the role of religion. Okay. Now, for economic and financial institutions, well, their function is more on resource gathering, resource mobilization, but their roles, well, that's different. That depends on the economic system in place in a particular state or in a particular country. Okay. So, for example, the monetary policy and the fiscal policy would vary in different contexts in developing versus developed countries, in socialist free markets versus liberal economic systems. So you would see that they have different ways in which they enforce their functions, and that's very important right here. Remember that each institution has their own function, they have their own role. All right. The next one talks about structures. All right. What do we mean by structures? On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, structures are patterns. They're not entities in themselves. So structures can talk about carried out practices. So those inherited, those passed from one point to another, whether we're talking about space, whether we're talking about time. Okay. So that's structure. Okay. Structures have I've given here, or I have provided here, some general observations of what a structure is. Structures usually govern interactions, all right? So for example, the way in which we communicate respect might be different in contexts and even in cultures. For example, in Thailand, they would go with the Y or the bow. For us Filipinos, we would go with the mano. For what else? For Western civilizations, usually they with the handshake. But now in the COVID-19 era, we know that since we don't see each other face to face, usually it's opening the it's usually turning on the camera, or it's also usually what else. If you see each other face to face, hopefully it's just with an elbow bump. So it's not cultural anymore, but it's situational. We're in a pandemic wherein we lessen our contact with one another because of physical distancing purposes as part of our health protocols. So that's what we mean by structures governing interactions across individuals and societies. That the pattern has changed because of such pandemic, for example. Or when you go to another country, a handshake you offer a handshake and they suddenly go with a Y, you know what to do. That's not their pattern of respect. Their pattern of respect is about. Okay. On the other hand, secondly, structures either permit or restrict change from happening. So an example that I've already used earlier was how COVID-19 was able to alter our interaction patterns, whether we like it or not. But generally, for structural functionalist perspectives, or for the worldview of the structural functionalist, generally structures will restrict change. So, what are examples of this one? Culture is a perfect example of how structures do not generally allow change to happen. Say, for example, in a culture where seniority is usually upheld compared to capability, corporations or workplaces would promote first people who are older rather than considering or substantially considering people who are capable. All right. So, say for example, a 50-year-old who has a basic skill set of level 5, for example, comparing it to a 25-year-old who has already level 70, and even 7, the B is still higher. In, of course, again, in a workplace that highly commends the age, you would promote per se before you promote B. I'll give an example of that, in a real life example of that. Usually the norm is in PNP. The one who gets to be the hepe, or the one who gets to be the chief, is usually the most senior. So usually people would ask why, for example, this particular police officer was promoted before this particular officer. Usually some seniority norms are there, and they don't plan to change that anytime soon, because that has been, again, the pattern of interaction. That has been the pattern of power transfer happening. And that's perfect for my third discussion of properties of structures, which is all about power dynamics. Structures dictate power dynamics because you're able to see who has power, who has not. You're able to see who makes the decisions, who doesn't. You're able to see who sets the agenda, who doesn't. You're able to also see who shapes our perspectives, and who doesn't. Now, what are some perfect examples of structures dictating power dynamics? Structures dictating power dynamics, for example, is in education. The way in which we teach students, for example, back in the day, it's very rote, it's very factual, it's usually from lower order skills, comparing it to higher order skills. But now, since there has been a paradigm shift, in the educational sector, wherein we see that the students should learn things like critical thinking, analysis, cultural sensitivity, and whatnot, that they cannot learn if they continue to memorize dates in history, for example, or if they continue to just simply stop at memorizing the symbols of the periodic table of elements and whatnot. Wherein power dynamics would now simply say that a person is powerful if he has the skills. All right, so that's the example of structures dictating power dynamics. How do you acquire power? And so what if you have that power? That's something that exists in a structure. Okay. Now, this is an interesting discussion. I'm already at my 40th minute. I hope you're still here. But if, for example, it's already overloading by far, can pause from time to time, of course, feel free. Okay. So we're discussing modernity and contemporaneity. So something that involves history and trends. Okay. So let's first understand these terms, because more often again than not, modernity and contemporaneity are more often interchanged, or more often they refer to one and the same thing. So for example, the first bullet would say that usually it refers to anything that's not the pre-modern, or anything that's part of the imperial history. When you say the imperial history, that's the Roman Empire. What else? It's the dynasties in China, or what else? In India, the same thing, the dynastic systems. In Southeast Asia, the era of the mandalas. Okay, so that's not it. Okay, simply to say, we're not talking about that. But there are some starting points that we need to consider. That's going to be my discussion. But before that, conventionally, modernity assumes that the world evolves in such linear fashion. That, for example, since you live in an era of empires, right now you don't see empires anymore because that's old, or that's simply primitive. Okay. But there are also some criticisms about this particular concept. What makes it modern? What makes it contemporary? Now, starting points of modernity. So, since I assume that my audiences would either be history teachers or would be mindful of history, perhaps it's important that you also go back to these and you don't just stop at the facts and the changes that took place. You also need to discuss the implications at some point in your respective classes. For example, in the Western context, usually they bank upon modernization or modernity through these revolutions. The scientific revolution that's birthing, for example, the natural science, for example, about by that's uh, discipline of Newtonian physics, that since he was able to discover the laws of motion, that paved the way for more innovations to actually kick in. For example, since we know the laws of motions, I don't know what they are. Instead, the one about um, perpetual motion machines. All right? Machines that run by themselves eternally. All right. So since we know that we have limitations set forth by the law, for example, that's the scientific revolution. Now, for the French Revolution, this was the political this is abstracting themselves from the tyranny of monarchy, but transforming themselves into a modern state. All right. Now, the third one is an industrial revolution. One is social and economic and even cultural, because this one has dictated, number one, how our economy would eventually work. We've learned how to mass produce. Number two, we've learned how to do specialization and division of labor. For example, some workers are not advanced work, hence we can assign them market, because since you pay them, that's the event. But of course, maybe weaknesses, if you will, because we have learned that in the scientific revolution, again, the way in which the modern period has been critiqued. Not every version of the truth has all. I mean, not every dimension of the truth, sorry, has been discovered. And even then, some of them have been proven to be false. Secondly, the French Revolution, we all know that eventually they're going to be replaced by the same power-hungry people. In the Industrial Revolution, that it gave them jobs, they gave them jobs that are not humane. They don't have benefits. They do not have better working conditions. So that's the implication right there. Not necessarily linear. Hence, for example, the failures of the Industrial Revolution in some areas have brought about the rise of communism. All right. Or for example, in the French Revolution, that in its success cases, which was led which has led to the American Revolution, but in some cases, it has led to another revolution. So what do you call that? Is that another modernity? Is that a modernity on top of another modernity? So the same thing for the scientific revolution. We have proven that not only science has told us it's the truth. So what is that? What does that mean? Is that the scientific, the neo-scientific revolution? So this one is a very interesting thing to think about, because not everything again that has been called modern, everything that has been called the truth is actually the modern is actually the truth. Okay. Now in Eastern civilizations, they have a different world going on for a lot of reasons. Number one, Eastern civilizations have been the subjects of colonization or being placed under spheres of influence because not every area in the East has been placed under colonial subjugation. Examples there are Japan, China, and Siam, all right, so now Thailand. Okay. Now you would see that there, if for each area, even they would have, or for each region, they would have their different understand and they would have their different starting points of modernity. Like India, the birth of, or I mean the emergence of the British Raj would pave the way for their own narrative of modernity. Why is that so? Because of course a lot of changes have happened. So that has led to, for example, political movements to be born, like the concept of satyagraha and what else, the non-violence, ahimsa, yeah, being placed in politics. That back then it was just something very religious and social. Same thing for what else? For the economy, since a lot of people have been recruited for example, for agriculture, for even machine, for even industry, and yeah, okay. So that's for India. I mean, for a lot of things, since our time would not permit us to actually discuss that too lengthily. For Southeast Asia, generally, they have this certain modern narrative or this narrative of modernity when decolonization happened. So that's, for example, after the East Indies have been uh, yeah, has been declared independent by either the Dutch or the British, or for example, in the case of the Philippines, after being after again unshackling ourselves from Spanish colonial rule, but eventually was again replaced by American colonial rule. But eventually, in the 1940s, we were able to unshackle ourselves again from American rule after a peaceful quote unquote transition, which was actually coincidentally went together or overlapped with World War II. So that's our narrative of modernity right there. For China, very complex situation as well. Are we talking about um, modernity in the sense of the fall of the dynasties? Because the Qing or the Republic of China under Dr. Sun does not constitute modernity. Other narratives would say that it's actually 1949, where the People's Republic of China currently still in power right now, or which is still currently officially called as now, can be the starting point of modern, all right, or modernity in that country. For Japan, very interesting as well. Some would say, or scholars in the field have claimed that it's also the Meiji period, which is also actually similar to the entry of the West in Japan because of a lot of things. Because of course, after closing themselves from the entire world in some period, and then it was during the Meiji wherein they have rebranded themselves as, of course, a civilization with its own life. Okay, so very different perspectives here of modern, just by talking about modern. All right. It's also important to discuss that aside from social, political, economic, and cultural shifts, there's also an intellectual shift, all right, that took place in modernity, regardless of the context, okay? Because, for example, you would see here that even in Eastern civilizations, for example, their educational systems also changed. In the Western view, we're talking about the scientific revolution, that we've learned about the laws of motion. We've learned about the Cartesian plane. We've learned about philosophy, those kinds of things. So modernity is also something intellectual. Okay. But then again, how is it different when we talk about contemporary? When we talk about contemporary, uh, it's more recent. Okay. For the intentions of this video, let's set the subcontext first. Like what happened after maybe modernity? But you would say that in the earlier slide, World War II, okay, already went first compared to some of these eras. But later you would see the reasons why this one would start the modernity. This one would start contemporaneity. It's just a subcontext because after the World War II, okay, it has been enshrined as an important concept that should govern all states in the world. as of course proven by the existence of the United Nations. They've tried and they've tried all right to establish the same thing back after the World War I, which was the League of Nations, but eventually was, of course, didn't come into a success due to a lot of reasons. But this time it worked. And so far it has been working. All right. But then again, even with this enshrining of peace in our systems, the world was still comprised of blocks of influence, especially after the victory of the Allied forces in World War II. Because after World War II, the world was for the United States for the taking, but the Soviet Union wasn't there to take it all in. All right. Hence, the world has plunged into another war, but it was called the Cold War for a lot of interpretations. Usually, they would say that it wasn't really an actual war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Another case would be it's more of an ideological war rather than an actual war again. And that's just a couple of the many interpretations of the name. But in this case, we have seen, as I've mentioned, that the world has now been comprised of blocks of influence. Hence the terms first world, second world, and third world, okay? Which we don't use now. Okay, please do not use that now in your classrooms. Okay, later I will talk about them. Okay, in the second bullet. All right, for the first world is usually those part of the liberal world order. You know, America and all of their friends. Okay, I cannot list them now right now because well, there are a lot of them, and I don't know all of them. Okay, the second world are comprised of the socialist allies. So that's the USSR and their friends, China and whatnot. Okay, but the third world is like everyone else, those who do not claim to be a part of the first world or of the second world. But we know that there's another connotation why it's called the third world. That's because the third world is comprised of people who have come from decolonization phases, or those who are not as developed as either the US or the USSR. Okay? That's why in current discourses, some people still use third world, which I highly disagree because again, the context of the term third world isn't necessarily poor nations. It just so happened that third world countries back then were poor nations. Okay. Now, to make a long story short, in the Cold War, with the defeat of the Soviet Union, it was actually the emergence of the liberal world order. Now, some scholars would always now go back to the idea of contemporaneity as characterized by two things. Number one, after the Cold War, and number two, the branding of globalization. For example, college courses called the contemporary world would always talk about globalization. Some of my students would talk about globalization again with me because they're taking another course that talks about globalization. So two things that you need to remember about contemporaneity, post-World War context, and globalization. Okay? That's why in today's time, we no longer call third world nations third world. We call them developing with an ing, gerundial form, active. Okay. On the other side, if you want to talk about first world, they're developed states. You know, U.S., Britain, China, those kinds of countries. Okay. So that's contemporaneity and modernity, and I hope I've given clarity to the concept. So be mindful about what terms you use in class, because when you talk about the modern, when in fact you're actually referring to the now, maybe you want to talk about contemporary. Okay, that's why in the same thing in my field of expertise, or in my field of enthusiasm, I normally refer to my field of enthusiasm again as contemporary China. I don't I don't necessarily label my research enthusiasms as China because that's an overwhelmingly huge chunk of knowledge. And even contemporary China is already an overwhelmingly huge chunk of knowledge. So be mindful again of how you use these terms. Okay. So just a general close of this topic, we've been talking about contemporary and modern because it helps us keep track of the changes taking place in the world. So I've already mentioned earlier what changes were we referring to when we talk about modern and what changes took place when we talk about contemporary. On the other side, it also provides certain lessons on fundamental issues governing the world in a post-World War context. That at the birth of modern and contemporary worlds, we see that there are a lot of other challenges that have risen. Because this is actually echoing some of the criticisms against Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist. It actually echoes a criticism against his argument that after the Cold War, history is over. Like this is actually the end all be all of things, and we're expecting nothing. But no, in I mean, in the post Cold War era, we have seen challenges against democracy. That's why Trump won. That's why populists have been rising throughout the globe. So that's another challenge towards this post Cold War context. That's just one in politics. Second is the rise of economic crisis. How sure are we that we are going to still be economically safe despite the promises brought about by a capitalist world order? Third is an epidemic that is currently plaguing us now. How are we going to be secure despite the presence of such viruses that's gonna emerge and mutate eventually? And how our healthcare systems coping, or how can they cope eventually? Okay. Now this is more fun, trends and mega trends. That's because we're just continuing what we have been mentioning earlier, which is all about modern and contemporary. But trends are more of concepts in which we can guide our discussions and our students as to how can we navigate through change, how we can also examine change, how we can even research change, okay, in some contexts. Now, some definitions are necessary. When we talk about general directions or patterns of change, that's a trend. All right. So when we say general patterns of change and development, for example, there's always the reemergence of social movements that are based on, for example, race. Back then, we had the Black Revolution, or what I forgot the exact term. I'm sorry. That was spearheaded by Sir Martin Luther King. All right, or Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, that if I got the name correctly. When in fact, still in the 21st century, we still have Black Lives Matter, right? So those kinds of things. Or we've had the feminist revolution back in the 20th century as well. We still see the same things right now, which is the movement. It's different, but it speaks of the same rhetoric, or it speaks of the same message that there should be equality between men and women. We've seen the Stonewall riots that have actually spearheaded the LGBT movement, but until now we still see the same things that forward the rights and the privileges, even, or the welfare. I mean, that's a fairer term. The welfare of the LGBT movement or the LGBT members, you know? So that's a trend right there. On the other side, we've also seen mega trends. Mega trends talk about those that are in a global scale. Okay? When we say global scale, that encompasses observations on generally almost in the entire globe. Okay? Now, what are some of these 20th century mega trends that you need to be mindful of when you try to discuss when you try to discuss your lessons? Okay. For example, in MIL, some of you would have to be mindful of high tech, of what else? A world economy event, networks. Okay. In political science, terms like what? Yeah. Okay. Decentralization, participative democracies, they're all essential right here. What else? Religion courses would talk about self-help, how religion has now been individuated compared to social, although it's still social, because you don't see religions, of some, for example, some fictional character in television, you know. So that one. Just to have a brief discussion of each. When you say industrial societies, this is what it looked like in the Industrial Revolution, the rise of plants, the rise of factories. That's an industrial society right there. And I think almost the entire globe is now industrial, you know. There are just some enclaves that are still, pre-industrial. When you say pre-industrial, still in the agricultural side, still feudal, sometimes even primitive. But now societies are more information based because we now see the fourth industrial revolution. I think this deserves a separate session in itself. But when we talk about information societies, these are societies powered by data. And we know right now that it's not just money that's going to dictate your power in the economy. It's now information. It's now data. That's why you've been hearing about Bitcoin, you've been hearing about what else? Electronic payments and other forms of similar stuff, that's because information societies are now governing us. Same thing from forced technology to high technology. When we talk about forced technology, these are technology still. Like these are machines, but highly labor intensive. But we're talking about technology. High technology, which is more convenient centered, which is more what else? Ergonomic centered. When I say ergonomic centered, very compact, very small. What else? National economies to a world economy. This one is very evident. For example, when we talk about financial crisis, that in back in 1997, the one that started in Thailand, the most highly affected region was Southeast Asia, and most of Southeast Asia's partners are actually also affected by this crisis. Same for the 2008 financial crisis on the housing bubble. Were also own crisis back in 2004 or 2008 or 2012. Cannot remember anymore. But one of those that when Greece's economy was already in shambles, the rest of Europe actually had, you know, their fair share of suffering. That's because they're all part of the single world economy. Centralization to decentralization. Centralization means all power is in one center. Right now, it's diffused. Right now, it's decentralized. Almost all of us now have power in more ways than one. So that's what you mean by decentralization. One significant form of decentralization that took place was about or concerned China, all right, when it opened its doors to the Western world after the Cultural Revolution or after the death of Mao, or at least the economy from a complete command economy have now transformed itself to a hybrid of market and some state socialism right there. So that's decentralization. Although they haven't fully decentralized, and no economy right now is fully decentralized, you know that. Still, it's a significant step compared to their highly command and collectivized, economy. Industrial help to self-help. This is also the rebranding from industries or from companies having to be rank oriented, culture oriented. Now we have had work that is actually upholding the person, the individual worker to actually be as empowered as he should be. So what else? Some services right now, some applications are also, bound for self. All right. Or is also now based on the self. Sorry, not bound. Based on the self. Okay. Representative democracy to participative democracy. What am I talking about here? Instead of electing people who think like us, who look like us, now it's important for the sake of democracy, not just to put them in power, but to also to make sure that we inflict that change as probable as we can. This includes, even if you cannot vote, you still can talk about politics, right? This is very much evident in the youth that even if, for example, we're talking about 15 years old, 16 years old who cannot still be legally voters, but they have also been communicating about their preferred um, politicians or statesmen. They've also been communicating about their history, some shared things that even if they haven't lived through that period of history, they also have their own opinions about it. That's something that the previous generations weren't necessarily able to do for a lot of reasons, but now we're able to do it. And of course, from hierarchies to networks. Corporations right now, well, at least in some corporations, they place regard now on networks compared to hierarchies. Although hierarchies are still definitely important, that's why it's not eliminated. But the emphasis is now more on how you can be a good worker is not necessarily just by following your boss or by not just going to do whatever your higher ups want you to do, but it's also having the networks necessary for you to progress. That's one example of hierarchies to networks. Another example is instead of our social interactions governed by traditions of respect and courtesy, our socialization is also dictated by those that we know and those that they know, so on and so forth. That's why social networks emerged. All right. And for example, even social interactions are governed by this. Say, for example, dating. All right. Even before the birth of dating applications, dating has already been network based. Say, for example, hey, I'm looking for a partner of some sort, and then your particular friend would actually look for a partner suitable for you, someone he knows that you don't know, right? And that establishes the network right there. Okay. So that's how I can vividly describe to you the 20th century megatrends. But the 21st century has given us more changes. That's why these are trends. Okay. So there's now the booming global economy, although back in 1991, they haven't predicted the 1997 FICAL crisis, nor the 2008 global crisis, nor the COVID-19 pandemic, but still, actually, that's also a good thing that you might want to be mindful of. Since some of you might be experts in economics, you might want to use the cases of financial crisis as points in which economies were able to revive themselves or economies were able to shift from one system to another in order for them to be saved from such crisis. So that's one thing in which you can look at it. Another one is economic operations. Definitely, regional blockings have a lot of role in that. So definitely, these are things that weren't present back in the day. So these are the mega trends of the 21st century. The Renaissance in the arts. This is something that is very much relevant in contemporary arts classes because art forms have not, of course, and will definitely not stick to one standard. And arts has always been, responsive to the way in which the world looks like right now. That's why newer art forms come in, like digitized art. What else? Films are now done digitally. What else? Performance art even. So aside from the mediums of art, even the essence of art is trying to be challenged and changed. So performance, not performing, by the way. Performing arts is different. Performance art is also something that is trending right now in the art scene. That when for the intentions of this video, performance art is talking about refers to daily life or any aspect of the human condition as espousing art in itself. I'm not an artist, so I think I did not do a proper definition of it, but that's one way in which you can. A manifestation of performance art is Lady Gaga. Right? Back in 2008, 2009, we know that she wasn't necessarily the popular the popular pop star. Like some people love her, some people were okay with her, but quite controversial in her own right because she was able to challenge notions of success. Not necessarily because she was blasphemous, because she was antichrist, but because it was an expression of human reality. So art wasn't necessarily just confined to what's pleasurable, but art should also espouse reality. That's what the Renaissance in the arts through performance art was given to us, or that's how it was introduced to us now. Now, free market socialism, perfect example here is China. I need not say more, but when we talk about a free market socialism, it's the balancing between some sort of free market capitalism, but still with substantial control coming from the government. In this case, the market. What are some examples of this one? China's usually empowered by state-owned enterprises, meaning to say businesses there are substantially owned by China, although some international competition can enter there. That's why there are foreign brands in China. So that's making them more competitive, and that's also making them more innovative. That's why lately the term China phones are no longer that much of a buzzword because China phones literally today refer to Oppo, Vivo, and we know that they're not substandard cell phones. In fact, they're very much good, or relatively better compared to the China phone of the time, right? So we know that such free market socialism has led to a lot of these changes for the better. Okay. And some are for the worse, of course. Now, fourth one talks about global lifestyles and cultural nationalism. What are we talking about here? Global lifestyles refer to what has now become the dictated way of living that's not just confined within a particular country. Perfect example here is K-pop. All right. K-pop has been manifested as, for example, a consumption of popular culture that is not just Korean, but is also global. Perfect example is BTS because of their use of English and because of another factor, which is, of course, their charisma. Like it's something that sets them apart compared to other Korean pop groups, right? And we have also seen that in cultural nationalism, wherein BTS meals are all over the place. I mean, we're not necessarily labeling it as pure McDonaldization of the world, but it's McDonaldization plus some sense of global lifestyle, which is, consuming some merchandise that's representative of this particular Korean pop group. Cultural nationalism is also evident in McDonald's in another respect, wherein when you go to another country, their McDonald's offer a different product. For example, it's here in the Philippines where you see a McDonald's offering rice. But when you go to America, they don't have rice meals right there. Or rice meals right there are not that buzz, right? Go to India, they don't offer beef burgers because cows for them are sacred. When you go to Japan, there are a lot of sakura flavor things. When you go to what else? To China, that depends on the region of China. For example, some of them would have spicier burgers, even if you didn't even order a spicy burger. That's because that's embedded in their culture. And you see that in these different enclaves or in these different countries in the world. That their McDonald's represent their culture, their food culture. Okay? The rise of women in leadership is also very significant to cite because they are not only just bringing this some sort of trend that they're able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic properly, but they're also able to make that statement that their masculine and even patriarchal counterparts are not able to deliver. For example, people like in Germany, Angela Merkel. In New Zealand, you have Jacinda Ardern. In Taiwan, you have Tsai Ing-wen. So these are examples of women who are competent enough, and they were actually able to combat the pandemic in the early stages. Well, right now there have been resurgences in New Zealand, in Taiwan, but that doesn't necessarily reflect about being women leaders, but they're just conditions of the countries. Meanwhile, in countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, where in the initial parts of the pandemic, surges were very significant. What else? Some sort of incompetence was branded and became the buzzwords of these governments and has actually also been attributed to being too masculine, like what's happening right now in the Philippines. So that's what the rise of women in leadership has brought to us. Aside from governments, you've also talked about rise of women billionaires, especially in China. So very few billionaires in the world, and some of them are women, and some of them are located in key areas in the world. That says something, and it's up to you in your classes how you're also going to flesh that out. Religious revival, because you would know that in the modern, so I'm talking about the modern world, so the modern world which was brought about by a schism. When you say the schism, the divide between the church and the state, or I mean the schism is, no, sorry, that's secularism. I'm talking about secularism, wherein the birth of secularism talked about the separation of church and state. Well, schism has some other business going on. We can integrate that later. But for now, when we talk about secularism or the separation of church and state, we have learned to actually live our lives without having to be affected too much by religion. But actually, 2000, according to Naisbitt and Aberdeen in 1991, they predicted that religion would eventually have, or they stipulated that religion would eventually have a role again in society. And I think we're seeing that right now. That in cases of crisis, people have turned to religion as, again, the opiate of the masses, if you will, like what Karl Marx said, or maybe even some sort of individualism. That, for example, you've learned how to transform religious practices into something that you can do for yourself as maybe part of a self-care routine, like yoga. Yoga, which was originally Hindu, is something personal and fitness, you know? So that's religious revival, and it has come in a lot of ways. Individualism, lastly, is the transformation of societies from collective units to individual units. So you would see here that mindsets are very important. The way people think are no longer societies are now no longer about groups, but are now rather oriented towards the self. Although it's not a pure shift to individualism, because there are still some cultures who highly regard of the family. There are still some cultures who highly regard the collective, like Eastern civilizations, for example. But right now, we still see the emergence of individualism. We see this in a generation. It starts with the millennials until it goes forward. That it's more of the prestige of the self, comparing it to the welfare of the society. And it has both its pros and cons. Again, in class, it's up to you on how you're going to flesh that out. All right. So this one is MIL. I think before we talk about MIL, uh, this is important to mention that in this discussion, MIL talks about more of skills compared to concepts. All right. Although I'll still be introducing some concepts, but still take note more of the skills, because how this concept is going to be relevant to your class is, aside from discussing it in MIL class, you also might want to integrate these skills in other humanities and social science courses. This will be the last topic before I end this first part. So at least I will be able to pause for a while, because I've been talking for 1 hour and 20 minutes now. So that's let's continue. So one thing, as proposed by Alagaran, all right, a few years back. So he's one of the spearheads of media and information literacy here in the Philippines, is that MIL is actually a composite concept. What does that mean? MIL, which stands for Media and Information Literacy, is not just about media literacy and information literacy. Because back then, MIL was tagged as either media education or information literacy. But MIL right now is comprised of all of these literacies that surrounds this bubble. Say, for example, information literacy is also related to others like news literacy. Because how would you know if a certain news item is fake or not? Definitely, news literacy would have to require you to have some sense of information literacy. How would you check? How would you do your own fact checking? In the event that even fact checkers might be propaganda machines, and that's very possible in a post-modern world or in a post-truth world, you know? So that's one thing. Okay. Another type is, for example, if you don't know how to check for facts or how to verify some facts, but you don't know how to use the internet well, that's gonna be a problem, because your information literacy and news literacy might be hampered if some sense of internet literacy is not necessarily present. Okay. Same thing with games literacy right here. If you're able to play your games properly, but you're not necessarily, of course, FOE or FOI literacy, that you're not practicing your freedom of expression properly, that you trash talk too much even if you win a particular round, that's going to be a problem, because, of course, you're not an MIL person. You're not a media and information literate individual. Okay. And a lot more. So these are key areas in which you need to understand, okay, how to govern your classes, because if you're going to, for example, require them to watch a particular documentary about, for example, martial law, it will not just require some sense of television literacy, perhaps it would also require some sense of information literacy. Are the things that they're watching are either pro Marcos or anti Marcos? So that's very crucial in developing an understanding of course, that particular period in history. And we don't want them to either be brainwashed by either side. Okay? So that's one. Or for example, in the case of cinema literacy, if people are emotionally charged too much after a particular ending of a particular film, then are they actually really appreciating the message or the premise of the film as espoused by the particular director or by the particular artist? So those kinds of things are necessary for us to actually consider. Okay. For example, you wanted to watch this particular film for philosophy, and all they did was felt for the person who just died because of, for example, old age, and he was able to still teach his students the promise of, if you know how to die, you would know how to live. Then again, your students might not appreciate the philosophy of death and philosophy of life part. So be mindful about how you're letting your students consume media, how you're letting your students, for example, consult sources like the library. If you're going to require them to use the library, and if, for example, you even don't know how to use it, or for example, they just see the library as a mere source of books or journals and without even proper strategy and thinking, that's going to be a problem right there. Okay. But then again, it would also have inverse benefits that if they're news literate, your balitaan or your news reporting would be very fruitful. Because one strategy right here is, if you're going to give them a news report activity in class, whether weekly or daily, I don't know, that's up to you. They're not just practicing news literacy, they're not just practicing information literacy. But in my case, whenever I do news reporting, I want them to tell their opinions. I want them to practice FOE as well. So if they think that what they read is saddening, despite other people thinking that it's a happy news, then they still have the ability to still say what they think, despite that they actually thought differently compared to their classmates. Okay, so that's the importance of MIL right there. That MIL again is not just a concept, but it's also a skill. In fact, it's a lifelong learning skill. Don't expect your students to also understand MIL in your particular class, especially if you're not even the MIL teacher, because even in an MIL semester, it's not going to be enough to teach them all of these things. In fact, if you let them commit these same mistakes, it's your job to actually guide them and let them go back to the proper that. For example, a particular item that is not necessarily accurate, your job is not to call them out. I mean, not just to call them out, but at least to also provide them the necessary tools so that they would not have to repeat it again. Same thing for films, that if they just cried after a particular film, your job is to process it. Your job is to ask them the key questions why they felt that way. And maybe, just maybe, how are you going to or not question, but to verify the validity of your feelings after you've processed key events and key parts, and even what else? Dimensions of a film, because films are not just about narratives. There's editing, there's sounds, there's actors, of course. So that's the wonderful world of MIL right there. Then this is going to be the last discussion for information for MIL, which is all about what we know usually as fake news. And when we talk about fake news, it's already an outdated term, more so a vague term. So it's better to use the term information disorder, because information disorder talks about an outcome-oriented situation in which this is the result of fake news, that it has resorted to a disorder of some sort. There are three general types of information disorders that's dependent on falseness and harm. Meaning to say, you get to ask either number one, is it really false or is it really true, depending on what you really wanted to ask. Number two, what's the intention of the particular information? Because, of course, there are some incorrect pieces of information that aren't necessarily harmful, nor wasn't exactly intentional. Those are just simply misinformation. That's part of this black circle. Okay. On the other side, let's go to the uh, middle ground, the one that overlaps falseness and intention to harm. If it's not just incorrect, but it's also intentionally built to place malice on you, for example, or to manipulate your readers, that's what you call disinformation with the letter D. Okay? On the other side, last, okay, we're now talking about any piece of accurate and true information that has the intention to harm. That's what you call malinformation. So it depends that that depends on which is really, the factor that you're dealing with. I mean, what factors are you dealing with when you read a particular information or a particular piece of information? Two things that you need to ask: true or false. What's the intention of those who created this mistake, or the intention to create this particular piece of information? If it passes either one, you have to determine which one of it that would fall that would fall under either misinformation or malinformation. On the other side, if it's both false and intentionally harmful, that's what you call disinformation. There are a lot of more specific examples of each. For example, misinformation will talk about news reports that aren't necessarily verified. So it's either just a result of a negligent mistake or a human error that wasn't exactly supposed to be there. All right, so that's what misinformation might look like. On the other side, malinformation could look like something like hate speech. All right, it's true that they're part of a certain minority. It's true that they're part of a certain race that's reflective of their skin color, but you're already placing intentions of harm towards these minorities or towards these people. So that could be an example of malinformation. On the other side, if you really tampered with existing information, or if you invented some sort of information out of nowhere, and the intention is to actually harm either, for example, the president or the vice president or anyone. So, for example, you have satire. When you say satire, these are intentionally mistaken information, but just used for comedic purposes, which is still capable of harm, of course. That's disinformation right there. Or, for example, those that try to become actual sources themselves. For example, mainstream sources like the Philippine Star, you would brand yourself as the Philippine Star, but with a different name, but with the same colors, or but with the same initials, with the same logo. That's disinformation right there. Because you have the intention to harm, which was to disguise yourself as the legitimate source. But then again, everything or most of the things that you would be spewing right there are false. So that falls under disinformation. So that's already 1 hour and 30 minutes of discussion. That's hopefully uh, fruitful enough for us to actually think of what approaches we can develop for the classroom, or what questions can be raised for the classroom depending on our topics or depending on our courses to be handled. But rest assured, these would actually provide you the insights, and these would provide you what else to explore upon based on the discussions that we have made. All right. So we conclude right here, and the rest of my discussions, which would be all about politics, if I remember properly, politics, development, and religion and philosophy would be there. So, all right, that's it. Thank you very much, and have a great day.